A lot of these revolutionary technologies that became eventually the engines of growth also created a lot of political revolutionaries along the way. Now, the point of the book is not to predict a socialist revolution, but I think it is noteworthy that levels of income inequality have been increasing over the past 3 decades or so, and they are approaching levels not seen since the first industrial revolution. And there are many factors that are shaping the income distribution. There's no question about that. But mechanization or automation is definitely not one of them. And clearly, it's not driven by textile machinery or steam engines this time around. The technology is very different. But it is anything having even more pervasive impacts on the labor market. And as you can see, this process has been going on for some time. The first electronic computer was invented at the University of Pennsylvania in 1947, or 46, sorry. But it consisted of roughly 18,000 vacuum tubes. It weighed 30 tons. And as a result of that, it didn't have much impact on the labor market. It took the invention of the microprocessor and later on the invention of the personal computer for businesses to realize that A, they could restructure supply chains in ways that allowed them to take advantage of cheap labor in emerging economies like China. And secondly, they could automate routine, repetitive tasks on mass scale. And the consequence of that is best shown by this figure, where you see that as productivity grows for most of the 20th century, wages are growing in tandem. So early machinery is creating a lot of demand for operators whose skills are augmented by the machinery, and the technology complements them in a happy way. And that's quite different from robotics, who are replacing those sorts of workers in production. And as a result of that, you're seeing a growing gap between wages and productivity growth. Now, for all the talk of rising inequality, I think the greatest tragedy is actually that certain groups in the labor market have been left worse off in absolute terms. So if you look at the wages of men with no more than a high school degree, they have actually been falling for prime-age men with no more than a high school degree for 4 decades now. So it's not just a question of the labor market becoming more equal. Opportunity is diminishing very rapidly for people who used to take on jobs in factories before robots were being adopted on wider scale. Now, one of my favorite lines from the book is that if you put one hand in the freezer and the other in the stove, you should be feeling quite comfortable on average, but we know from experience that that is not the case. And I think the same can be said about the US labor market, right? Unemployment is trending around 3.6%, right? It's looking very healthy on the surface, and if you go to certain places like most coastal cities, it's also doing really well. But people in the Rust Belt in particular, in cities that specialized in manufacturing industry, which have suffered from deindustrialization caused by offshoring and automation, are not doing so well. You can see, if you look at labor force participation rates among prime-age men again, you can see that joblessness is on the rise, and it's especially in these places. There are more robots in Michigan alone, for example, than the entire American West. And that is where most of its problems are. And we know from a great body of research that joblessness also comes with a lot of bad social consequences. Economists tend to think that the purpose of production is consumption, but we actually know from a very big body of research that that's not true. People attach a lot of meaning to the work. One of the most consistent findings across countries, across different periods of time, is that people who work are happier than those who don't. And if you look at the communities where jobs have dried up, you see that marriage rates are declining, more children are growing up in single-parent households, crime is on the rise, health outcomes are worsening, suicide and alcohol and substance abuse is on the rise, and it is not a very healthy development. And if you want to understand why three key swing states, being Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, who had opted for the Democratic candidate in every election since 1992, all of the sudden ended up voting in President Trump in 2016. Automation is one of the prime reasons, and this is joint research with Xinshi Shen and Tor Berger showing that. And one of the key points is that we have seen nothing yet. We've already seen a backlash against globalization, but automation has so far primarily been confined to routine rule-based activities. But the potential scope of what machines can do is expanding very rapidly. Due to recent advances in machine learning and artificial intelligence in particular, machines are now increasingly incapable of inferring the rules of the game themselves. They can tap into the digital trails that we leave behind us when we interact online. They can learn through trial and error. And as a result of that, they are able to perform tasks that were inconceivable to automate a few years ago, like driving a truck, diagnosing a disease, translation work, document review, so on and so forth. And what all of these approaches have in common is that they are driven by increasingly large data sets that allows machines to predict what a human would have done in any given situation. So for example, if you want to program a car to drive in the city of Oxford, it's almost impossible to foresee every given situation that the vehicle might encounter. You just can't. But you can actually fill in the blanks by gathering loads of data of people driving and then trying to predict what a human driver would have done in that given situation. Now, I am simplifying a bit, but it's broadly this pattern that is driving everything we're seeing in technology today. And some of you might say, well, I used Google Translate yesterday, it's not perfect, and autonomous vehicles, where are they? But I think it's important to remember that every technological revolution started with imperfect technology. The early steam engines, for example, were merely used to drain coal mines, yet they were the ones that eventually became the prime movers of the Industrial Revolution and powered economic growth for a very long time. And I think that we are actually very much underestimating the potential impacts that AI could have on labor markets. The first reason being that machines don't have to be perfect in order to outperform us, because we certainly are not. So this is a study of Israeli judges and their decision-making during the day. And you can see that early in the morning, after we had our morning snack, insulin levels are high and we make a very high share of favorable decisions. That then tends to drop off during the morning, bumps up after breakfast again, and the same after lunch. And we are very much shaped by what we eat, how much we sleep. Some of us have bad temper in certain situations. So machines are actually have a comparative advantage in a wide range of tasks just because of that. The second point is that for automation to happen, machinery doesn't necessarily have to replicate every motion that the human does in his or her job. So we didn't automate away the jobs of lamplighters, for example, by building robots capable of climbing lampposts. We didn't automate away the jobs of laundresses by building robots that could walk out of the home, chop down trees, carry woods and piles of water into the home, then heat the water on the stove and then perform the motions of hand washing, right? We did that by inventing the electric washing machine that does an entirely different set of motions. And because engineers are very good at finding these clever ways of restructuring tasks to make them automatable, the potential scope of automation is much greater than many people actually think. Nonetheless, there are certain domains in which human workers still hold a comparative advantage, and this is joint research with Mike Osborne here at the Martin School that goes back to 2013. And what we did is we tried to sort of think about in which domains machines still perform very poorly, where there have been very little progress in recent years. And I think one example that illustrates this quite well is Turing test competitions, right, where chatbots try to convince human judges of them being human. And a lot of pundits argued, I think it was about 3 years ago now, that there was a big breakthrough then, because one chatbot had managed to convince 30% of human judges of it being a person. But it did so by pretending to be a 13-year-old orphan Russian boy speaking English as his second language with no understanding of English culture. And if you think about the variety of much more complex social interactions that you do in your daily jobs, we try to persuade people that you're right, you negotiate certain things, you try to motivate your colleagues, it's almost inconceivable that we will have an algorithm that's able to perform that in the foreseeable future. And I think the same is true of creativity, and there's a big debate in the machine learning community, admittedly, with regard to whether algorithms can be creative. But I think people who think that they can be or think that they are tend to conflate novelty and creativity. So I could draw something here on the wall and call myself an artist, but few of you would be likely to buy my painting. And the tricky part here is not to generate something that is novel, it's generating something that is novel and makes sense. So if you think about, for example, software writing classical music, you can certainly take your sort of favorite symphonies, and maybe they're all Mozart, and say that these are the best symphonies that have ever been written, and then allow the algorithm to come up with some recombination of that. And that's very likely to sound quite similar to Mozart. But you're not going to arrive at Stravinsky or Schoenberg by doing that. And I think one of the reasons for that is that when humans are creative, we draw upon data and experience from all walks of life, sometimes even a dream. And in many cases, when tasks require creativity, much of your data is likely to be outside the training data set. The last bottleneck is maybe the least intuitive one. It relates to the perception and manipulation of irregular objects. So sort of very easy things for us, distinguishing between a piece of rubbish that's on the floor or a really important document, straightforward for most of us to do, not actually so easy to explain. And similar tasks like distinguishing between a pot that is dirty and holds that is dirty and a pot that holds a plant, also quite intuitive to us, not so easy to automate. So unfortunately, I think the job of the cleaner is one of the last we are likely to see disappearing. That being said, there are a lot of jobs that are not very intensive in tasks that require creativity and complex social interactions. And in fact, the majority of jobs in transportation, logistics, retail, construction don't. And as a result of that, the potential scope of automation is quite significant. So you can think about 3.5